Tonight we begin with a development that United States officials had feared, Israeli intelligence had tracked, and regional analysts had predicted for months. A move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that rewrote the security architecture of the Middle East. 72 hours that triggered emergency consultations between Washington and Jerusalem. 72 hours that brought two of the world's most powerful militaries to the highest state of alert we've seen since October 2023. What Iranian President Pezeshkian did this week crossed a line that the Biden administration had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Israel did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with overwhelming force, and with a message that echoed across every intelligence agency from Tehran to Moscow. The Washington-Jerusalem alliance didn't just activate tonight. It demonstrated exactly why Iran's latest gamble may prove to be its most catastrophic miscalculation in decades. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official communications, not diplomatic cables, just signals, that Tehran was preparing something unprecedented. Iran has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability that Western intelligence agencies had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Langley and Tel Aviv this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian military communications know the indicators, the increased chatter between IRGC commanders, the movement of mobile missile launchers from hardened bunkers, the sudden influx of technical personnel to underground facilities, the rotation of naval assets through the Strait of Hormuz. All of that went quiet. And whenever Tehran goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Pezeshkian came to power promising a different approach. He spoke of dialogue. He spoke of de-escalation. He spoke of economic revival through diplomatic engagement. But behind the moderate rhetoric, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The hardliners who control Iran's security apparatus never trusted Pezeshkian's softer tone. They saw it as useful cover, a way to buy time while advancing programs that would fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. And for months, that cover worked. Western capitals wanted to believe that Pezeshkian represented genuine change. They wanted to believe that engagement was possible. They wanted to believe that the nuclear talks could resume in good faith. But this week, that illusion shattered. Early Tuesday morning, Israeli military intelligence detected what they described as unprecedented activity at Iran's Natanz enrichment facility, including the activation of advanced centrifuge cascades that had not been operational in over 14 months. These are the kinds of technical moves that Tehran only makes when they are signaling something very specific. A breakthrough in enrichment capability, a deliberate provocation to test Western resolve, or preparation for a rapid sprint toward weapons-grade material. Western intelligence agencies didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Iran was changing its nuclear posture. And when a threshold nuclear state shifts posture without explanation, even by small technical increments, every intelligence service from Washington to London to Jerusalem pays immediate attention. The International Atomic Energy Agency had been warning for months that Iran's cooperation had deteriorated. Inspectors were being denied access. Monitoring cameras were going dark. The baseline understanding that had allowed some transparency was collapsing. But what happened this week went beyond non-cooperation. According to sources with direct knowledge of Israeli intelligence assessments, Iran conducted what appears to be a coordinated test of its entire nuclear command and control architecture. This included encrypted communications tests between the Supreme National Security Council and military commanders, movement of personnel associated with Iran's weaponization research to previously unknown facilities, and most alarmingly, the preparation of delivery systems that have only one logical purpose. When Israel's military chief presented these findings to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the response was immediate. Within 6 hours, Israel had placed its entire strategic forces on heightened alert. The warning issued by Washington tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior official after senior official emerging from Emergency and National Security Council meetings described Iran's move as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with any path toward peaceful resolution. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, speaking to reporters at the State Department, used language that diplomats rarely employ unless they want to send an unmistakable signal. The United States, Blinken said, will not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. That commitment is ironclad. And the actions we've seen this week suggest that Tehran may be testing that commitment. He paused. They should not. But diplomatic warnings only work if the target hesitates. Iran did not. In fact, their response to initial American concerns was among the most defiant we've seen in the entire history of the nuclear standoff. Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian dismissed Western concerns as theatrical hysteria and accused Israel of manufacturing crises to justify aggression. He said Iran's nuclear program was entirely peaceful and that any military action against Iranian facilities would be met with consequences that would reshape the region. Here's what we know about what happened next. Within 18 hours of Iran's defiant statement, Israel launched what military analysts are calling the most sophisticated intelligence operation against Iranian nuclear infrastructure since the Stuxnet attack. These weren't the limited cyber intrusions of previous years. These were deep penetration operations, multi-vector attacks that Israeli intelligence only deploys when they are preparing to degrade a target's operational capability entirely. Tonight, Israeli Defense Forces confirmed that they conducted precision strikes on Iranian military positions in Syria, including a command facility near Damascus that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was coordination of advanced weapons transfers to Hezbollah. Israel struck before Iran could disperse its most sensitive assets. They hit the command center. They hit the communications infrastructure. They hit logistics hubs that were likely preparing to move air defense components to protect high-value sites. In other words, Israel targeted the connective tissue of Iran's regional military network, the support structure that would have enabled Tehran to respond to any future strike. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Iran's nuclear acceleration wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of threshold crossing that could produce a weapon within months if left unchecked. And Israel, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike inside Iran, not yet. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit military command nodes. They hit weapons transfer points. They hit the architecture that Iran has spent years building to project power across the region. Pentagon officials, speaking on background, acknowledged that the United States provided real-time intelligence support for the Israeli operation. This included satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and what one official described as enhanced situational awareness, a euphemism that suggests far deeper coordination than Washington typically admits publicly. The message was clear: when Israel acts against Iranian threats, America is not a bystander. The Washington-Jerusalem alliance is not theoretical. It is operational. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. Intelligence analysts now believe that Pezeshkian's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of the Western alliance after months of diplomatic strain over Gaza. Tehran wanted to see whether Washington would distance itself from Jerusalem amid criticism of Israeli military operations. They wanted to see whether European capitals would pressure Israel to accept negotiations rather than confrontation. They wanted to see whether the cracks they'd observed in Western unity would widen under pressure. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't hedge. They issued a joint statement with Jerusalem that was so unambiguous, so coordinated, that even Tehran's most optimistic analysts noticed the shift. You don't get Iran's attention easily. They've spent 45 years learning to read American weakness and exploit division. But today, they saw something they weren't expecting: unity, speed, and capability that exceeded their planning assumptions. Defense analysts speaking with major Western outlets under anonymity described Iran's strategic posture as probing, a way to map response thresholds without triggering immediate escalation. But Israel and the United States proved today that they remain both willing and able to respond with overwhelming force. Their operations were not only precise, they were calibrated so carefully that Iranian air defenses never detected incoming threats until impacts were confirmed. That operational security matters because it shows something critical. It shows that Israel has penetrated Iranian defensive networks at levels Tehran didn't believe possible. It shows that Washington's intelligence sharing with Jerusalem goes far deeper than public statements suggest. And it shows that Iran's carefully constructed deterrence architecture has significant vulnerabilities that their adversaries know how to exploit. Israel is not simply reacting to Iranian provocations. They are anticipating them. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the coordinated response. The Israeli Air Force carried out over 40 sorties targeting Iranian positions across Syria and Lebanon, forcing emergency evacuations at multiple Hezbollah command posts. Israeli naval commandos targeted a weapons shipment in international waters that had been transiting from Iran to Yemen in the last 72 hours. American B-52 bombers operating from Diego Garcia reportedly repositioned to forward staging areas used by the United States to signal readiness for extended regional operations. Additionally, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group received orders to extend its deployment in the Persian Gulf, a move that only happens when Washington anticipates potential combat operations. This wasn't just posturing. This wasn't just messaging. This was alliance coordination at its most sophisticated. This was operational integration that takes years to develop. And operational integration is the one thing Iran has struggled to match since the Islamic Revolution. Tehran has proxies. Tehran has missiles. Tehran has cyber capabilities. But Tehran does not have allies who share real-time intelligence, coordinate targeting, and synchronize operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. For every advance Iran has made in its regional influence, the Washington-Jerusalem alliance has countered with something that complicates Tehran's strategic calculations. Remember, Iran thought the Gaza conflict had isolated Israel diplomatically. They thought months of international criticism had weakened Netanyahu's government. They thought American attention was divided between Ukraine, the Pacific, and domestic political turmoil. They thought this was the moment of maximum opportunity. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. American forces are surging into the region rather than withdrawing. Israeli operations are expanding rather than contracting. And international focus is shifting from criticism of Israeli tactics to alarm about Iranian nuclear ambitions. Tehran read the strategic environment wrong. They saw division and assumed it meant weakness. They saw criticism and assumed it meant abandonment. They saw complexity and assumed it meant opportunity. But the Washington-Jerusalem alliance has survived far greater tests than the current moment. And tonight, it demonstrated exactly why that alliance remains the most formidable strategic partnership in the Middle East. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Pezeshkian's latest move happened at a time when Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is under unprecedented internal pressure. Hardliners want acceleration toward nuclear capability before Western resolve can stiffen. Reformists want dialogue to ease economic suffering before social unrest becomes uncontrollable. The IRGC wants confrontation to justify its institutional dominance and budget demands. And ordinary Iranians want relief from sanctions that have crushed living standards for years. Khamenei is balancing these demands while facing questions about succession that become more urgent with each passing month. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because internal contradictions demand external action. This is the pattern we've seen before with isolated regimes. When domestic legitimacy falters, foreign adventures become tempting. When internal factions compete, external provocations can create unity. When economic failure looms, nationalist confrontation can distract populations. Tehran may believe that nuclear threshold status will protect the regime from all these pressures. But tonight's response suggests that the opposite may be true. Acceleration toward nuclear weapons capability is not making Iran more secure. It is making Iran a target. Washington's warning, now transmitted through multiple diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to accept a nuclear-armed Iran under any circumstances. Senior officials said plainly that Iran's recent actions were inconsistent with stated commitments to peaceful nuclear development. That is diplomatic language for, "We know what you're doing, and we will not allow it to succeed." You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. The White House released a statement late this evening confirming that President Biden had spoken directly with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The call lasted over an hour. Details of the conversation remain classified, but officials described the exchange as substantive and detailed. Translation: they discussed operational planning, not just diplomatic coordination. They discussed what comes next if Iran continues on its current trajectory. And they discussed the circumstances under which American military power would directly support Israeli action. For those who have followed this conflict for years, tonight's developments represent a significant threshold. The policy of strategic patience that characterized earlier approaches to Iran appears to be ending. The assumption that negotiations could eventually constrain Iranian ambitions appears to be collapsing. And the willingness to use military force as something more than a theoretical deterrent appears to be growing. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the Israeli public in a somber, direct speech tonight. He said, "The state of Israel will not allow those who threaten our existence to acquire the means to carry out that threat." He said, "We have shown patience. We have shown restraint. But patience has limits, and restraint should never be confused with weakness." And he said, "Tonight, our enemies learned that Israel sees everything, reaches everywhere, and will act whenever our survival demands it." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a government that understands just how high the stakes have become. Netanyahu has survived politically by positioning himself as the leader uniquely capable of managing Iran's threat. Tonight's operations demonstrate that he intends to validate that positioning through action, not just words. The Israeli public, exhausted by months of conflict and internal division, appears to be unifying around the immediate threat. Polls released earlier this week showed that over 70% of Israelis support military action to prevent Iranian nuclear capability. That number has likely increased after tonight's developments. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Iran's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the nuclear facility activation, Hezbollah forces in Lebanon also increased their launch tempo, firing over 100 rockets into northern Israel in the past 72 hours. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq conducted drone attacks against American personnel at Al-Assad Air Base. And Houthi forces in Yemen increased maritime attacks targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea. All of this happened within the same 7-day period. When Iran moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This is not coincidence. This is coordination. This is Iran signaling that it can impose costs across multiple fronts if its core programs are threatened. But the reverse is also true. When Israel and the United States respond, they too can impose costs across multiple fronts. And tonight's operations demonstrated exactly that capability. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Iran is preparing for a diplomatic off-ramp, using nuclear acceleration as leverage for sanctions relief in future negotiations. Another is that Iran is attempting to establish facts on the ground before potential American political transitions complicate Western policy. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Iran is attempting to achieve threshold nuclear capability before any military response becomes politically feasible. But today, Israel took that last option off the table. They didn't wait for diplomatic clarity. They didn't wait for international consensus. They didn't wait for Iranian intentions to become undeniable. They acted on capability, not intent. They demonstrated that the window for Iranian nuclear breakout is not as open as Tehran assumed. And they showed that military options are not abstract contingencies, but operational realities that can be executed with minimal warning. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Iran wants to see whether economic and diplomatic pressure can fracture Western unity before military options become necessary. Israel wants to show that its operational reach exceeds Iranian defensive capabilities. Washington wants to prevent regional escalation while maintaining credible deterrence. And the rest of the Middle East wants to prevent a conflict that could devastate economies, destabilize governments, and reshape regional power structures. The stakes could not be higher. A nuclear-armed Iran would transform the Middle East fundamentally. It would trigger proliferation by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and potentially Egypt. It would embolden Iranian proxies from Lebanon to Yemen. It would threaten Israel with existential risk and complicate American power projection for decades. That is the future that tonight's operations are designed to prevent. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Iranian communication networks for signs of leadership response. They say Khamenei has convened an emergency session of the Supreme National Security Council. They say IRGC commanders have been recalled from forward positions to Tehran. And they say Iran's decision to accelerate nuclear activity is likely part of a broader strategy intended to establish deterrence through ambiguity, the suggestion of nuclear capability without formal acknowledgement. But Israel is not accepting ambiguity. In fact, Israel is demanding clarity. Their response today, swift, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Tehran that ambiguity will be treated as threat. And it sent a message to Washington that Jerusalem expects operational support, not just diplomatic cover. The Biden administration appears to have received that message clearly. American military assets continue flowing into the region. Intelligence sharing continues at unprecedented levels. And coordination between the Pentagon and Israeli Defense Forces has reached depths that officials describe as seamless. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Iran hoped to achieve with this week's nuclear acceleration. But what we do know is that the Washington-Jerusalem response was timely. It prevented Iranian assets from dispersing to more defensible positions. It degraded command and control infrastructure that would have complicated future operations. And it demonstrated alliance cohesion at precisely the moment when Tehran hoped to exploit division. What happens next will depend on what Iran does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate and signal willingness to return to meaningful negotiations, this moment will be remembered as successful coercive diplomacy. If they escalate further, Israel and the United States have already shown they are prepared for extended confrontation. They have positioned forces. They have coordinated targeting. They have demonstrated capability. And they have shown they are ready to respond at whatever level Iranian actions demand. The war drums that began sounding this week are not metaphorical. They are operational preparations that both sides now understand is real. And tonight, for the first time in years, Tehran appears to be uncertain. The Supreme National Security Council is quiet, too quiet. And when Iran's leadership goes quiet, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Pezeshkian and Khamenei learned something they have learned many times before, but perhaps underestimated. Israel will not wait for threats to materialize before acting. The United States will not abandon its most important Middle Eastern ally under pressure. And the Washington-Jerusalem alliance is not a diplomatic convenience. It is a strategic reality backed by overwhelming force. This story is far from over. The nuclear standoff that has defined Middle Eastern security for 2 decades is entering its most dangerous phase. The calculations that have prevented direct confrontation are shifting in unpredictable ways. And the margin for error that once allowed diplomatic resolution is narrowing with every passing day. But tonight, one thing is clear. Iran's reckless challenge has crossed a red line that will not be uncrossed. The Washington-Jerusalem alliance has activated with a unity and speed that Tehran did not anticipate. And the war drums now sounding across the region are not background noise. They're the soundtrack of a confrontation that may define the next decade of Middle Eastern history. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.